something that fucked with my mind a little bit was this concept of a stable coin, but that is not stable related to a fiat currency
Yeah.
or an asset or anything. It took me a while to try and understand it, and I don't think I completely understood it, to be honest with you. So can we just go into that?
Definitely. That's, I would say, one of the features of Themelio that people get excited a lot, because that's actually the reason why Polychain funded our company. They actually didn't know Themelio existed. They just saw a paper I wrote on its stablecoin, and they were like, what is this like non-peg stablecoin thing you're working on? Are you going to commercialize it? We're going to give you funding, right? Like that's what they were really interested in. And I think for good reason. So just to give a summary, the base currency of Themelio is called MEL.
Mail.
It's like, Ether for Ethereum. So MEL is, it's a completely decentralized cryptocurrency, but it's also stable, as in it doesn't have a value that goes up and down all the time. Now, this is actually unprecedented in the field. You have this dichotomy nowadays between, you have coins like Tether, like USDT, like DAI, that are pegged to fiat currency. And you also have currencies like Bitcoin that just don't have any base.
Just do whatever, yeah.
They just do whatever they want to do, right? And conventionally, we say this is unavoidable because with a stablecoin, you need oracles, and oracles are centralized. They're not trustless. Now, what MEL is that it kind of squares this circle a bit by saying, we actually can have a stablecoin without oracles, without any trust. We just have to peg it to something other than the US dollar, because the US dollar is not trustless. You need oracles to measure the US dollar. So that's kind of the basic overview of MEL. It's a stablecoin, but it's not pegged to the US dollar. And what is it pegged to then? So it is pegged to something called the DOSC, or Day of Sequential Computation.
Okay, can you spell that out for people that don't know?
DOSC. So
DOSC.
Day of Sequential Computation. Yeah. And what the DOSC is actually very simple. So it is an index that measures the cost of sequential computation at a given point in time. What does that mean? So this means that, let's say in the year 2000, the price of one DOSC would be defined as the price of renting the fastest computer you can find and occupying it with sequential computation for 24 hours. And the same thing, the one DOSC today will be right now going to find the fastest computer and doing that on the same computer for 24 hours. So what this has two very interesting properties. First of all, this metric actually redefines itself as computers become faster. So the DOSC at a given point in time is defined in terms of computers of that time. So that is why today a DOSC is actually about the same money as a DOSC 20 years ago. You can actually check this by calculating the cost of renting a CPU core for a day in 2000 and a CPU core for a day now. It's actually pretty much the same. So the computers have gone faster, but the highest end computers have always been about the same price. And that's a really useful property. So the second interesting property of the DOSC is that not only is it stable, it actually is trustlessly measurable. And that is the really cool part about it, which is that unlike the US dollar, we don't need to tell people, don't need an oracle to tell us how much a DOSC is. How do we do this? How we do this is very simple. We airdrop some tokens, right? So actually what we do is we airdrop some of the proof of stake tokens, which are not a stable coin. So we airdrop some tokens and we run an auction saying, waste your CPU cycles to get that. And whoever wastes the most gets it, right? So essentially we're measuring how much CPU cycles people are willing to pay to get a particular token, right? And this proof of work is done through sequential proof of work. There's actually a cool way you can actually measure only sequential work. So now what you have is actually an exchange rate between sequential work and that token. And how do you get day of sequential work? right? That's actually also very simple, which is that when people are doing this contest, right, you measure how long they take to run the proof of work. And then the fastest person defines what a day is, right? So now you have an exchange rate between a day of sequential proof of work and a cryptocurrency. Now you can use this to bootstrap your system, right? So now you have
there's the obvious question there. How do you keep the peg?
Yeah. So like that's the next part, right? So now we have this is essentially the oracle that's telling us how much now is a day of sequential computation. Now that's kind of the bootstrap for everything. This is like how kind of the USD oracle is at the heart of every other stablecoin. This is the oracle at the heart of Mel, right? This on-chain trustless benchmark thing going on. Okay, so now we know how much what the DOSC Mel exchange rate is. All we got to do now is to, do something to shift this towards 1-to-1. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And this we actually do with a mechanism that is somewhat similar to other blockchains. So the idea is that when the Mel is too expensive, right? So we need to print more Mels, right? So the way we do that is that we actually print Mels and use them to buy SIM. So SIM is actually a proof of stake token, and that is not the main currency. So we stake with SIM, but we pay people with them. So that's when we want to expand the money supply. We simply print Mels and buy SIM off of the open market. And this is also possible because we actually have a DEX built into the Themelio protocol. So Themelio actually comes with a Uniswap-like decentralized exchange where you can buy and sell any token. So the blockchain simply prints some Mels and buys SIM on this market. And that increases the Mel supply until the Mel DOSC ratio is 1-to-1. Now, when the Mel is too cheap, right? So you need to decrease the supply of Mels. You just do the opposite. You print SIMs, which are the proof of stake token, and use those to buy Mels on the market, which decreases the supply of Mels and increases its demand until Mel DOSC is 1-to-1. Does that make sense? So this is somewhat similar to the way a lot of other stablecoins work, but not based on USD oracle, but based on a computational oracle.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for me, that I don't think about computation that much, except when we're writing an article or something. But you're telling me if I would have bought, let's say, one day of the fastest computer I could find back in 2017, and if I do that now, that would be more or less the same price, or has that changed?
More or less the same price. So
All
it
right.
hasn't changed. Yeah.
Do you see some kind of inflation there or some kind of deflation there?
I don't think it's a trend. Basically, I think it's pretty much the same. I think it all boils down to commodity prices, really. It all boils down to kind of electricity, silicon, whatever CPUs are made out of, and also the human labor involved in putting those things together. So I think fundamentally, this is measuring real resources in an indirect fashion. But we have to use this indirect fashion to get rid of the oracle. We have to use something trustless. So I would say this would be somewhat of a commodity standard.
This would be like the closest thing, the closest trustless thing that you could do that is similar to pegging a stable coin to a basket of assets, right? But like in a trustless manner.
Essentially, you're pegging it to whatever goes into the CPU, essentially.
And in some way that you could even call that a continuation of Satoshi's work, whereas the original primitive Bitcoin would be measured on the electricity spent to generate that coin. Now your coin is in a new system that actually wants to use it. It's it works backwards. Yeah.
I think I actually think that's a common misconception. I think that Bitcoin's pricing is not based on electricity. And the reason is because of this. In Bitcoin, you don't have a fixed exchange rate between electricity and Bitcoins. You have a fixed block reward, and people fight over it with electricity, essentially. So the supply of Bitcoins is not based on electricity. Just to give an example, let's say if electricity becomes expensive, the supply of Bitcoins will not go down. it will still be the same block reward, just people will mine it. Yeah. If electricity becomes expensive, the supply of if electricity becomes cheap, the supply of Bitcoins also will not go up. So the price of Bitcoins, which is based on the supply of Bitcoins, that doesn't depend on the price of electricity at all. Instead, I think it's somewhat of the opposite, as in, when Bitcoin goes up, people use up more electricity and vice versa. So
You're right.
So I think like the idea that Bitcoin is backed by the proof of work, I think that's a fallacy, because the amount of Bitcoin being printed is fixed. You don't get to print more because you use more electricity. You're only taking when you use more electricity, all the more Bitcoins you mine are kind of taken from other miners. They're not actually producing them. You're not actually producing the Bitcoins. Within like Themelio case, we don't have a fixed supply. The supply changes all the time to target this peg. And therefore, in Themelio's case, it does track the cost of these assets that make up the CPU.
Has there ever been another, just to add to your previous point, and you're very much right, because if that was the case, that Bitcoin was directly pegged to what proof of works generates, then you would just plug the whole Salvadorian volcano to it and mine all the Bitcoins in one day, right? Because that's producing a whole lot of energy, and that's not what happens. Like the algorithm limits how many Bitcoins are printed out. But what I was going to say is there any other models that you know of that are pegging stable coins to such trustless goods or assets?
I don't think so, actually. I mean, so I did publish this as a peer-reviewed paper, and if there was another one, probably it would not have gotten accepted. I think that there is, however, existing work on pegging stablecoins based on decentralized oracles, so to speak. So you have proposals where the oracle is based on people voting on things, or some like Schelling point idea and things like that. Yeah, and I was mentioning that I think the closest ones are stablecoins that try to use like a decentralized oracle. So they typically, what it is it's an oracle where anybody can contribute data, and it kind of like averages them out and things like that. It's really hard to make that kind of thing game theoretically sound. It's mostly kind of like, I don't think anything has been deployed like that before. And I think that ultimately is still not trustless. You're trusting in the crowds, right? You're trusting, air quotes, democracy to decide the oracle. But in our case, it's not really an oracle. We're not actually measuring something like the US dollar. We're actually just defining this metric that is on chain. So I think that's quite different. And I do think that the MEL is the only completely trustless stablecoin that I know exists.